Hello friend, welcome to Sleepy History World. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe so you never miss our daily journey into the fascinating stories of the past. Today, we're stepping back into the 1950s, a decade that many people remember as simpler, happier, and more innocent. But beneath the polished smiles, shiny cars, and picture-perfect neighborhoods, was a world filled with everyday habits that would seem incredibly strange today. Imagine a time when doctors appeared in cigarette advertisements, children rode in cars without seatbelts, families left their front doors unlocked, and youngsters disappeared outside from sunrise until sunset without anyone worrying. These weren't unusual events. They were simply part of ordinary life. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and let your imagination carry you back to a decade where the normal routines of everyday people now feel almost unbelievable. By the end of tonight's journey, you may never look at the 1950s in quite the same way again. Now, settle in, relax, and let's begin. If you could step through a doorway and spend just one ordinary day in the 1950s, you might be surprised by how familiar everything first appears. The shiny cars, smiling families, tidy neighborhoods, and cheerful advertisements create the impression of a simpler, happier time. But the longer you stay, the stranger the world begins to feel. Beneath the polished image was a decade filled with customs, habits, and everyday routines that would leave most modern people completely stunned. Many things that seemed perfectly reasonable back then would now be considered unhealthy, unsafe, or simply unbelievable. Yet for millions of people, these practices were just another normal part of life, barely worth mentioning. As the morning began, one of the first things you would notice is how many people were smoking. Cigarettes were everywhere. Adults smoked while eating breakfast, reading newspapers, driving to work, shopping, and even while holding babies. Ashtrays sat on kitchen tables, office desks, restaurant counters, hotel lobbies, and inside nearly every living room. Visitors were often offered a cigarette before they were offered a cup of coffee. Many doctors smoked in their own offices, and some even appeared in cigarette advertisements, claiming certain brands were smoother or less irritating. Pregnant women were rarely warned about smoking, and it wasn't unusual for people to light a cigarette inside hospitals. Airplanes, trains, movie theaters, and buses were filled with smoke drifting through the air. The smell became so common that many people hardly noticed it anymore. Children grew up breathing second-hand smoke almost everywhere they went, and very few questioned whether it might be harmful. Breakfast itself could seem surprisingly odd to modern eyes. Sugary cereals were heavily advertised as healthy meals, while processed foods proudly claimed to contain vitamins, without mentioning how much sugar or artificial ingredients they included. Families embraced canned meals, instant mixes, powdered drinks, and frozen dinners because they represented progress and convenience. Brightly colored gelatin dishes filled with vegetables, fruit, seafood, or even meat frequently appeared at dinner parties. Although many people today might struggle to imagine eating tuna suspended inside flavored gelatin, such recipes were proudly served to guests. Kitchens also relied on ingredients that are rarely seen today, with countless canned soups becoming the secret ingredient for casseroles that fed entire families. Food coloring, preservatives, and artificial flavors attracted little concern because convenience often mattered more than nutrition. Meanwhile, children were encouraged to drink plenty of whole milk, often several glasses each day, and butter was generously spread across nearly everything. Safety was another area where daily life looked dramatically different. Seatbelts were uncommon in many vehicles, and even when they were available, Countless drivers simply ignored them. Children stood on the front seat while parents drove, bounced around in the back without restraints, or even slept across the rear window shelf during long family road trips. Babies were carried in arms rather than secured inside child safety seats. Families piled into large station wagons without giving much thought to crash protection. Cars themselves featured hard metal dashboards, sharp steering wheels, and almost no protective padding. If an accident happened, injuries were often far more severe than they would be today. Yet many people accepted these risks without much discussion at home. Children enjoyed freedoms that modern parents might find shocking. It was completely ordinary for young kids to leave the house in the morning and spend nearly the entire day exploring neighborhoods without adult supervision. They climbed trees, wandered through forests, played beside rivers, built forts, and rode bicycles for miles before returning home around sunset. Parents often had little idea exactly where their children were, trusting that they would eventually return safely. Helmets were rarely worn while riding bicycles, climbing construction sites, or skating down steep hills. Broken bones, cuts, and bruises were viewed as natural parts of growing up, rather than reasons to limit children's adventures. Toys themselves reflected this attitude. Chemistry sets sometimes contained materials that would never be sold to children today. Metal darts with sharp tips flew across backyards. Realistic toy guns closely resembled actual firearms, and playground equipment often stood over concrete surfaces with towering steel slides that became painfully hot under summer sunlight. Monkey bars reached impressive heights. Merry-go-rounds spun at dizzying speeds, and seesaws launched children into the air with little concern for safety regulations. School life also followed rules that feel unusual today. Teachers maintained strict authority, and corporal punishment remained accepted in many classrooms. Students were expected to remain quiet, stand when answering questions, and show complete respect to adults. Discipline often seemed far harsher than modern educational approaches. At the same time, classrooms prepared children for possible nuclear attacks through regular air raid drills. When alarms sounded, students calmly crawled beneath their desks, covered their heads, and waited for instructions. Everyone practiced these exercises with serious expressions, believing they might someday save lives if nuclear war suddenly erupted. Looking back now, hiding beneath a wooden desk seems almost impossible to imagine as protection against such enormous danger. Yet these drills became routine for an entire generation. Household products created another strange picture. Many cleaning supplies contained chemicals that would later face heavy restrictions or disappear entirely from store shelves. Lead paint still covered walls in countless homes. Asbestos appeared inside insulation and building materials, and pesticides were sprayed with little protective equipment. People handled substances now known to be hazardous without gloves, masks, or warning labels because the long-term health risks were not yet widely understood. Beauty routines had their own peculiar habits as well. Women often visited salons for elaborate hairstyles that required enormous amounts of hairspray, setting lotions, and lengthy preparation. Some hairstyles remained untouched for an entire week, encouraging women to sleep carefully so they would not ruin them overnight. Cosmetic advertisements promised perfect appearances, while promoting strict beauty standards that placed tremendous pressure on women to maintain flawless homes, attractive appearances, and cheerful attitudes, regardless of how they truly felt. Men also faced expectations, usually centered around becoming dependable breadwinners who rarely expressed emotion. Society admired emotional restraint, and discussing mental health struggles remained uncommon. Many people silently carried stress, anxiety, or depression without seeking professional help, because doing so often carried unnecessary stigma. Television quickly became the heart of family entertainment, yet compared to today's endless streaming options, programming remained surprisingly limited. Many households had only one television set, often showing just a handful of channels. Families gathered together each evening because everyone watched the same programs at the same time. Missing an episode meant waiting for possible reruns months later, if they appeared at all. There were no pause buttons, no recordings, and certainly no smartphones distracting viewers during commercials. Those commercials themselves could feel astonishing today, especially when cigarettes, sugary foods, and questionable health products were enthusiastically promoted as symbols of happiness and success. Shopping also required far more patience than modern consumers are accustomed to. Without online stores or digital payments, nearly every purchase involved visiting physical shops, speaking with store clerks, paying cash or writing checks, and carrying purchases home personally. Credit cards existed, but were far less common than they are today. Many families carefully budgeted each week's spending, because financial planning depended almost entirely on physical money rather than electronic banking. Telephone calls introduced another completely different experience. Most homes shared one landline telephone, often attached to a wall with a long coiled cord. Privacy during conversations was limited because anyone nearby could easily overhear. In some communities, party lines meant several households actually shared the same telephone connection, making accidental eavesdropping surprisingly common. Long-distance calls remained expensive enough that many families reserved them for important occasions. If someone wasn't home, there were no voicemail messages or text notifications. You simply tried again later. Travel demanded more preparation too. Before GPS navigation, drivers relied on paper maps, roadside signs, or handwritten directions from friends. Getting lost was almost expected during long trips. Gas station attendants often filled fuel tanks, cleaned windshields, and checked engine oil, while customers remained comfortably inside their cars. Air travel itself felt elegant, with passengers dressing in suits, dresses, and polished shoes, because flying carried a sense of luxury rather than routine transportation. Medical practices reflected the limited knowledge of the era in fascinating ways. Antibiotics had transformed healthcare, creating enormous optimism that science would soon conquer countless diseases. Yet many treatments still seem outdated today. The family doctor occupied a place in society that seems almost unbelievable today. Many physicians knew several generations of the same family, and occasionally made house calls, arriving with a black leather medical bag to examine patients in their own bedrooms. It was common for people to wait until they were seriously ill before seeking treatment, believing minor problems would simply disappear with time. Antibiotics were viewed almost like miracle drugs, and there was widespread confidence that science would soon eliminate nearly every disease. At the same time, many medical recommendations reflected knowledge that has since changed dramatically. Doctors frequently advised extended bed rest for conditions that now encourage gentle movement, while vitamin tonics and mysterious health elixirs filled pharmacy shelves with promises that rarely faced serious scrutiny. Many families trusted advertisements almost as much as professional medical advice, purchasing products that claimed to improve energy, digestion, sleep, or overall health, without the kind of evidence consumers expect today. Even children's cough syrups sometimes contained ingredients that would never be approved under modern safety standards. One of the strangest sights for a modern visitor would be the complete absence of digital life. There were no smartphones vibrating in pockets, no social media feeds, no instant messages, and certainly no internet connecting millions of people. If someone wanted to know the weather, they listened to the radio or waited for the newspaper. If they wanted to settle an argument, they relied on memory, dictionaries, encyclopedias, or a visit to the local library. Finding information often required genuine effort, and patience became an everyday skill rather than an occasional necessity. Families spent evenings talking together, playing board games, listening to records, or simply sitting on the porch watching neighbours pass by. Entertainment was limited, but because everyone experienced the same limitations, few considered life incomplete. Neighbourhoods themselves operated according to customs that might surprise people today. Front doors were frequently left unlocked, especially in smaller towns, because trust between neighbours was considered normal. Children borrowed bicycles from friends without asking many questions, and cups of sugar, flour, or butter regularly travelled from one household to another. Whenever someone ran short while cooking dinner, neighbours often knew everyone's names, occupations, birthdays, and family histories. If a child misbehaved while walking through the neighbourhood, another adult might discipline them before informing their parents, and most parents accepted this without complaint. Communities functioned almost like extended families, with people watching over one another in ways that have become increasingly rare in many places. Laundry day required an entirely different level of effort than it does today. Although automatic washing machines were becoming more common, many households still relied on wringer washers, outdoor clotheslines, and plenty of manual labour. Clothes were hung outside regardless of the season, allowing sunshine and fresh air to dry them naturally. During winter, frozen clothing sometimes became stiff as boards before finishing the drying process indoors. Ironing consumed hours every week because many fabrics wrinkled easily, and clothing often required careful pressing before anyone considered it suitable for work, school, or church. Disposable fashion hardly existed, and garments were repaired repeatedly instead of being thrown away. Torn socks were carefully darned, missing buttons were replaced, and dresses or trousers were altered to fit growing children rather than immediately purchasing new ones. Even birthdays and holidays looked remarkably different. Children's birthday parties usually took place at home rather than expensive entertainment centres. Decorations were simple, homemade cakes were common, and gifts were often practical rather than extravagant. Christmas shopping focused more on thoughtful presents than endless quantities of toys. Many gifts were handmade by relatives, including knitted sweaters, quilts, wooden toys, and baked treats. Families gathered around a single dining table for hours, telling stories, playing games, and enjoying each other's company without anyone disappearing to scroll through a phone screen. The workplace also reflected customs that would appear unusual today. Employees often remained with the same company for decades, sometimes beginning immediately after school and retiring from the very same employer. Job hopping was far less common, and loyalty between workers and businesses was generally expected. Offices followed strict hierarchies, with managers receiving unquestioned respect from junior employees. Men usually wore suits, polished shoes, and hats, even during ordinary workdays, while women who worked in offices often followed equally formal dress codes. Smoking breaks required no designated outdoor areas because people simply smoked at their desks, filling entire buildings with clouds of tobacco smoke throughout the day. Restaurants operated under different expectations as well. Fast food was still developing, and many families viewed eating at restaurants as a special occasion rather than an everyday convenience. Diners became gathering places where locals discussed community news over coffee that was continuously refilled without anyone asking. Portions were generally smaller than those served today, and nearly every meal ended with homemade pie, pudding, or ice cream. Waitresses often remembered regular customers by name, along with their favorite meals, creating a level of personal service that many modern chain restaurants struggle to replicate. Schools encouraged skills that reflected everyday life during the era. Penmanship received serious attention because nearly every assignment was handwritten. Students practiced cursive writing for years, believing clear handwriting represented discipline and education. Home economics classes taught many girls cooking, sewing, budgeting, and household management, while boys often attended shop classes where they learned woodworking, metalworking, and mechanical repairs. These subjects prepared students for the social expectations of adulthood at the time, even though modern education has shifted toward different priorities. Weather forecasting remained surprisingly uncertain. Without advanced satellites or powerful computer models, forecasts often relied on limited observations, making predictions far less accurate than people enjoy today. Families simply accepted that weather reports might be wrong and adjusted their plans accordingly. Farmers watched the sky, studied clouds, and relied on generations of experience almost as much as official forecasts. Photography also felt far more precious. Every photograph required physical film, which meant every click of the camera cost money. Families carefully chose when to take pictures because they could not instantly review or delete them. Weeks sometimes passed before finished photographs returned from developing laboratories. Birthday parties, vacations, and weddings produced only a handful of carefully posed pictures instead of hundreds of digital images. Because photographs were so limited, they often carried greater emotional value and were preserved inside carefully arranged family albums that became treasured keepsakes for generations. Music required patience too. People purchased vinyl records, carefully placed the needle onto the spinning disc, and listened from beginning to end because skipping songs was inconvenient. Radio stations introduced listeners to new artists, and families often gathered around the record player during evenings. If someone loved a particular song, they waited hopefully for it to appear on the radio rather than instantly searching for it online. Teenagers memorized lyrics simply by listening repeatedly, sometimes waiting days before hearing their favorite songs again. Perhaps the strangest thing of all was how confidently people believed the future would become even more extraordinary. Newspapers predicted flying cars, robot servants, vacations on the moon, underwater cities, and household machines capable of doing nearly every chore automatically. Every scientific breakthrough seemed to promise an even brighter tomorrow. Although many of those dreams never arrived exactly as imagined, they reflected the incredible optimism that defined much of the decade. Looking back now, the everyday life of the 1950s feels like a fascinating mixture of remarkable progress and astonishing misconceptions. It was a world where people embraced modern inventions while unknowingly living with habits that future generations would find difficult to believe. That combination of confidence, innocence, and constant change is exactly what makes the decade so endlessly fascinating to explore today. Stepping into a typical supermarket during the 1950s would feel surprisingly different from walking through one today. Fresh produce occupied a much smaller section, while endless rows of canned goods proudly advertised convenience as the future of cooking. Housewives were encouraged to believe that opening a can or mixing a powdered packet, with water represented modern living. Companies competed to create foods that lasted longer on shelves, even if they contained ingredients that most people had never heard of. Bright packaging promised stronger families, healthier children, and happier dinners, and consumers rarely questioned the bold claims printed across the boxes. Shopping carts themselves were often smaller because families bought what they needed for the week rather than filling giant carts with bulk purchases. Plastic packaging had not yet completely taken over, so glass bottles, metal cans, and paper wrapping remained common throughout the store. Milk delivery was another ordinary sight that has almost disappeared today. Before sunrise, a milkman quietly drove through neighborhoods, leaving fresh bottles outside front doors. Families simply brought the bottles inside before breakfast, and empty glass bottles were returned for reuse during the next delivery. There were no plastic jugs piling up in recycling bins, and children often looked forward to hearing the familiar sound of bottles gently clinking together on the doorstep. In many communities, the milkman knew every family personally and sometimes became one of the most familiar faces in the neighborhood. Another everyday habit that seems unusual now was the amount of cash people carried. Digital payments did not exist. Debit cards were unheard of, and automatic teller machines would not appear for years. Wallets contained paper money, coins, handwritten shopping lists, and perhaps a checkbook for larger purchases. If someone forgot their wallet at home, there was no way to tap a phone or watch to complete the transaction. People carefully counted their money before leaving the house, and children quickly learned how to calculate change because it was part of ordinary life. Weather did not stop children from playing outside. Rain simply meant wearing boots. Snow meant building forts. And hot summer afternoons meant finding shade beneath large trees or cooling off with a garden hose. Air conditioning was still considered a luxury in many homes, so families relied on open windows, electric fans, and cool evening breezes. During particularly hot nights, people sometimes slept on screened porches or moved mattresses closer to windows in hopes of catching a little more fresh air. Entire neighborhoods seemed to come alive after sunset as families escaped the heat by sitting outside together, talking until darkness settled across the streets. Household chores required far more physical effort than most people experience today. Vacuum cleaners were heavier, dishwashers were still uncommon in many homes, and preparing dinner often meant peeling vegetables, grinding spices, and baking bread without the help of modern kitchen appliances. Many women spent hours every day cleaning, washing, ironing, and cooking, simply because there were fewer machines available to reduce the workload. Despite all this effort, spotless homes became a symbol of pride, and many families believed maintaining a perfectly clean house reflected good character. Children also learned independence at a remarkably young age. It was common for older siblings to look after younger brothers and sisters without constant adult supervision. 12-year-olds often babysat infants, while parents went out for the evening. Teenagers held newspaper delivery routes before sunrise, worked in grocery stores after school, or helped neighbors with yard work to earn spending money. These responsibilities were considered valuable lessons rather than extraordinary achievements. And many young people developed confidence through daily tasks that would now be handled by adults. Public transportation reflected different social customs as well. Bus passengers frequently greeted the driver. Strangers started conversations while traveling. And newspapers unfolded across nearly every seat during the morning commute. Without headphones or smartphones, silence often gave way to friendly discussions about sports, local events, or the weather. Train stations echoed with the sound of polished leather shoes instead of electronic notifications, and waiting rooms were filled with people reading books, magazines, or simply observing the world around them. Advertising possessed an almost unbelievable level of confidence. Commercials confidently declared that one soap was scientifically superior, one toothpaste guaranteed popularity, or one detergent would save marriages simply by making shirts brighter. Products were marketed with cheerful certainty, and consumers often accepted these messages without demanding detailed scientific proof. Mascots, catchy jingles, and colourful illustrations became deeply embedded in people's memories, because television offered relatively few channels, allowing advertisements to reach nearly everyone. School lunches also reflected the tastes of the era. Cafeterias served hearty meals that often included mashed potatoes, meatloaf, casseroles, vegetables cooked until very soft, and desserts that would seem unusually sweet by today's standards. Chocolate milk, whole milk, and generous slices of bread accompanied many lunches, while concerns about calories or sugar rarely entered everyday conversations. Children generally ate what they were served, because alternatives were limited, and picky eating was often discouraged. Libraries held a special importance that is difficult to imagine today. When someone wanted to research history, science, travel, or almost any subject, the local library became the first destination. Librarians possessed an astonishing knowledge of their collections and guided visitors toward the right shelves with remarkable speed. Card catalogues filled with thousands of neatly arranged index cards served as the search engine of the era. Finding information required walking through aisles of books, flipping pages, taking handwritten notes, and sometimes waiting weeks for requested materials to arrive from another library. Another surprisingly normal sight involved children collecting all kinds of unusual items. Bottle caps, comic books, baseball cards, stamps, marbles, and even pieces of colourful paper became prized possessions. Friendships were strengthened through trading collections, and entire afternoons disappeared while children proudly compared their latest discoveries. These simple hobbies required imagination rather than expensive electronics, encouraging creativity in ways that many adults still remember with great affection. The soundscape of everyday life also felt completely different. Instead of constant smartphone notifications, neighborhoods echoed with lawn mowers, bicycle bells, distant train whistles, barking dogs, children laughing, and radios playing from open windows. Church bells marked the passing hours in many towns, while factory whistles announced the beginning and end of work shifts. These familiar sounds created a rhythm that shaped daily life long before personalized playlists or streaming services filled people's ears. Perhaps one of the most fascinating differences was how slowly news traveled. Unless something truly extraordinary happened, many people waited until the evening newspaper or nightly television broadcast to learn about events happening beyond their own community. Breaking news did not interrupt every hour of the day, and many families experienced long stretches without knowing what was happening elsewhere in the world. This slower pace often allowed people to focus more attention on their immediate surroundings, spending more time with neighbors, relatives, and friends, rather than constantly following global headlines. Even waiting itself was considered. People waited in lines without staring at screens, waited days for letters to arrive, waited weeks for photographs to be developed, and sometimes waited months for popular household appliances to become available. Patience was woven into everyday life because there were simply fewer ways to make things happen instantly. Looking back from today's fast-moving world, that slower rhythm feels almost as strange as the fashions. the cars, or the customs of the decade. Yet for millions of people living through the 1950s, this was simply life as they knew it. A world moving at a pace that now feels almost impossible to imagine, filled with ordinary moments that have quietly become some of history's most fascinating memories. Walking into an office building during the 1950s would reveal a workplace unlike anything most people experience today. The steady clacking of typewriters filled every room as secretaries rapidly typed letters without the help of spell check, copy, and paste or email. Carbon paper allowed several copies of the same document to be created at once, leaving many workers with ink-stained fingers. By the end of the day, filing cabinets stretched across entire walls because every contract, invoice, and business letter existed only on paper. If someone misplaced an important file, employees might spend hours searching through thousands of folders. There were no cloud backups, no search bars, and no digital archives waiting to rescue them. Payday itself followed traditions that have nearly disappeared. Many employees received paper paychecks that had to be physically taken to the bank before they could access their money. Banks often closed early in the afternoon, meaning people carefully planned their schedules around banking hours. Long queues formed on Fridays as workers deposited their wages, cashed checks, and withdrew enough money to cover groceries, fuel, and household expenses for the coming week. Automatic deposits and online banking were still decades away. Telephone etiquette was another fascinating part of everyday life. Answering the phone usually began with politely stating the family name, rather than simply saying hello. Since most households shared one telephone, conversations were rarely private. Teenagers hoping to speak with friends often had to ask permission before tying up the family phone line. Parents sometimes reminded children that long conversations prevented important calls from getting through. When the phone rang during dinner, someone hurried across the house to answer because there was no voicemail to capture missed messages. If nobody answered, the caller simply tried again later. The family car represented far more than transportation. Washing and polishing, it became a weekend ritual, with fathers spending hours carefully waxing chrome bumpers until they reflected sunlight like mirrors. Cars were proudly displayed in driveways, and neighbors frequently admired each other's newest models. Many vehicles featured enormous tail fins, gleaming hood ornaments, and bright two-tone paint schemes that turned even an ordinary trip to the grocery store into a colourful display of style. Fuel was inexpensive enough that Sunday drives with no particular destination became a popular family activity. Another completely ordinary habit involved repairing nearly everything. Instead of replacing it, radios were repaired, shoes were resoled, watches were serviced, bicycles received new parts, and furniture was carefully restored rather than thrown away. Skilled repair shops existed in almost every town, and many people took pride in fixing broken household items themselves. A toaster that stopped working might remain in service for another 20 years after a simple repair, reflecting a culture that valued durability over convenience. Rainy days often brought a different kind of entertainment. Instead of reaching for streaming services or video games, families gathered around card tables for hours of board games, puzzles, storytelling, or reading aloud from favorite books. Children built forts from blankets, created imaginary adventures with simple toys, or spent entire afternoons drawing pictures. Boredom itself was accepted as something children should overcome through imagination rather than expecting constant entertainment from technology. Summer vacations also unfolded at a much slower pace. Road trips required folding paper maps across the hood of the car while deciding which highways to follow. Families packed homemade sandwiches into coolers because restaurants were less common along many routes. Children entertained themselves by counting license plates from different states, watching passing scenery, or playing simple word games during long hours on the road. There were no tablets, portable movie players, or charging cables stretching across the back seat. Looking out the window became the primary form of entertainment. Photography during vacations demanded careful planning. With only a limited number of exposures available on each roll of film, families posed deliberately before every photograph. Parents reminded children to stand still, smile properly, and avoid wasting film. Nobody knew whether the picture turned out well until weeks later, when the developed prints finally arrived. Blurry photographs were accepted as unfortunate surprises rather than instantly deleted and retaken. Fashion trends changed more slowly than they do today. Instead of following hundreds of influencers introducing new styles every week, people often wore the same dependable clothing for years. Well, made coats lasted decades. Shoes were polished regularly, and hats remained essential accessories for many adults. Tailors adjusted clothing rather than replacing entire wardrobes, and sewing at home remained an important skill that saved families considerable money. Many homes lacked the endless household gadgets people now take for granted. Microwave ovens were not part of everyday kitchens, meaning leftovers were reheated slowly on stovetops or inside conventional ovens. Electric mixers existed, but many recipes still relied on hand mixing with wooden spoons or metal whisks. Preparing dinner demanded considerably more time and physical effort. Yet many families viewed cooking together as an ordinary part of daily life rather than an inconvenience. One surprisingly common practice involved collecting and saving almost everything. Glass jars became storage containers. Leftover fabric turned into quilts. Newspapers lined shelves or wrapped fragile items, and old greeting cards were sometimes reused for craft projects. Throwing useful items away seemed wasteful because many adults remembered the hardships of the Great Depression and believed almost anything might prove valuable someday. Pets also experienced a different kind of life. Dogs often wandered neighborhoods freely during the day before returning home by evening, while cats roamed wherever they pleased. Few pets wore identification microchips or GPS trackers, and leash laws were often less strictly enforced than they are today. Veterinary medicine continued improving, but many routine treatments that are now considered standard were not yet widely available. Public behavior followed unwritten rules that almost everyone understood. Men frequently removed their hats when entering buildings. Children addressed adults as Mr. or Mrs., followed by their last names, and handwritten thank you notes were expected after receiving gifts. Good manners carried enormous importance, and parents worked hard to teach proper etiquette from an early age. Speaking politely, standing when introduced to someone, and offering seats to older adults were considered signs of good upbringing rather than exceptional kindness. Perhaps the most unusual difference was how rarely people expected instant results. Whether ordering furniture, waiting for a letter, repairing an appliance, or planning a vacation, delays were accepted as part of ordinary life. Patience wasn't admired because it was unusual. It was simply necessary. Modern technology has trained people to expect immediate answers, same-day deliveries, and instant communication. But the people of the 1950s built their routines around waiting. Looking back now, that slower pace almost feels like visiting another planet. Yet for the millions who lived through those years, it was simply the natural rhythm of everyday life. filled with traditions and habits that quietly disappeared as each new decade transformed the world once again. One of the most surprising parts of daily life in the 1950s was how little people knew about the long-term effects of sunlight. Families spent entire summer days outside without sunscreen, often believing that a deep tan was a sign of health, wealth, and an active lifestyle. Beach vacations became opportunities to darken the skin rather than protect it. Some people even applied oils to help themselves tan faster under the hot sun. Children played for hours without hats, while adults rarely thought twice about spending entire afternoons gardening, fishing, or relaxing outdoors. Sunburns were treated as temporary inconveniences instead of warnings about future skin damage. Another perfectly ordinary sight involved babies riding in cars completely unrestrained. Parents sometimes placed infants in portable baskets on the seat beside them, while toddlers stood between the front seats watching the road ahead. During long trips, children stretched out across the back seat and slept without any form of protection. If the family dog came along, it wandered freely around the vehicle as well. Looking back today, these scenes feel almost unbelievable, but few people question them because the science of vehicle safety was still developing. Door salesmen were also a normal part of neighborhood life. Throughout the week, someone might knock on the front door offering vacuum cleaners, encyclopedias, kitchen utensils, cosmetics, insurance, or household gadgets. Demonstrations often took place right inside the customer's living room, with the entire family watching as sales representatives showed how much dust a vacuum could remove, or how quickly a new knife could slice through vegetables. Purchasing expensive items through these personal visits was considered completely ordinary, and many lifelong friendships even began with traveling salesmen who visited neighborhoods year after year. Ice delivery still existed in some communities. Despite the growing popularity of electric refrigerators, families who did not own modern refrigerators relied on insulated ice boxes that required large blocks of ice to keep food cold. The iceman delivered fresh blocks regularly, carrying them with enormous metal tongs over his shoulder. Before carefully placing them inside the household icebox, children often rushed outside to watch the delivery, fascinated by the huge sparkling blocks that slowly melted throughout the day. Haircuts reflected another forgotten tradition. Many boys received nearly identical short hairstyles, while fathers often visited the same neighborhood barber for decades. Barber shops served as gathering places where local men discussed sports, politics, weather, and community events. While waiting their turn, the visit itself became as important as the haircut, creating a social routine that strengthened neighborhood friendships. Public clocks played a surprisingly important role in everyday life. Without smartphones constantly displaying the time, people relied on large clocks mounted in town squares, train stations, schools, factories, and department stores. Wristwatches were treasured possessions and often received as graduation or retirement gifts. If someone's watch stopped working, they might not know the exact time until passing another public clock. Another curious habit involved writing everything by hand. Grocery lists, birthday reminders, recipes, addresses, homework assignments, and personal diaries all filled notebooks, scraps of paper, and calendars hanging inside kitchens. Families maintained address books that were updated carefully whenever friends moved to new homes. Losing one of these books meant losing years of carefully collected information, because no digital backup existed. Vacations often included collecting postcards from every destination. Travelers proudly mailed colorful postcards, home describing their adventures, knowing the cards might not arrive until after they had already returned. Friends displayed these postcards on shelves or tucked them into family photo albums as souvenirs of places they hoped to visit one day. Sending postcards became almost as important as taking photographs. Home maintenance also required skills that many people no longer practice. Fathers regularly repaired leaking faucets, replaced broken roof shingles, sharpened lawnmower blades, painted fences, and maintained household appliances without calling professional repair services. Toolboxes occupied an important place in nearly every garage, and learning basic repairs was considered part of becoming a responsible homeowner. For many families, Sunday followed a routine that changed very little from week to week. Churches filled with people dressed in their finest clothing. Restaurants became crowded after morning services, and the afternoon often included visiting relatives or taking leisurely drives through the countryside. Stores in many towns remained closed, creating an unusually quiet atmosphere where neighborhoods slowed down almost completely for one day each week. Children experienced a level of freedom that seems almost unimaginable now. During school holidays, many left home immediately after breakfast, carrying nothing more than a sandwich or a few coins. They explored empty fields, climbed abandoned buildings, searched creeks for frogs, built tree houses from scrap wood, and invented elaborate games that lasted from sunrise until dusk. Parents rarely tracked their exact location, trusting them to return home before the streetlights came on. There were no GPS watches, location, sharing apps, or constant text messages asking where they were. Independence arrived early because daily life demanded it. Another forgotten custom involved borrowing books, recipes, and even household appliances from neighbors. If someone needed a ladder, sewing machine, lawn mower, or baking pan, they simply walked next door and asked. Communities relied on one another in practical ways because buying duplicate items for every household seemed unnecessary. These simple exchanges strengthened friendships and created neighborhoods where people genuinely depended upon each other. Perhaps the most fascinating difference of all was how people experienced silence. Without constant alerts, streaming videos, social media feeds, or endless notifications, many moments passed in complete quiet. Sitting on the porch after dinner, listening to crickets, watching fireflies, or reading a newspaper without interruption was entirely normal. Waiting rooms remained peaceful except for the turning of magazine pages. Train journeys offered long stretches of conversation or thoughtful silence as passengers watched the scenery pass by. Modern life rarely allows such uninterrupted moments, making the quiet rhythm of the 1950s feel almost unimaginable today. Looking back, it becomes clear that the strangest thing about the 1950s was not any single habit or tradition, but how confidently people believed their everyday routines represented the height of modern civilization. They embraced every new invention with excitement, while unknowingly living through customs that future generations would consider astonishing. It serves as a reminder that the ordinary moments of today may one day become the unbelievable history of tomorrow, leaving future generations just as amazed by our daily lives as we are by theirs. Even after the formal duties of the day had been completed, a wealthy Victorian woman's schedule was rarely entirely her own. Society expected her to remain constantly aware of her family's reputation, and this invisible responsibility followed her wherever she went. Every public appearance, every conversation, every item of clothing, and every visitor who crossed her doorstep contributed to the image her household projected. In a world where gossip travelled quickly through drawing rooms and handwritten letters, maintaining respectability required continuous effort. A careless remark overheard at a dinner party or an inappropriate friendship could become the subject of discussion across an entire social circle within days. Reputation was treated almost like another valuable possession, something that required constant protection. Shopping, for example, was not the casual activity many imagine today. Visiting fashionable streets filled with elegant boutiques was often an important social outing rather than a quick errand. Wealthy women spent hours selecting fabrics, ribbons, gloves, hats, perfumes, fans, lace, jewelry, books, and decorative items for the home. Department stores, which became increasingly popular during the later Victorian period, transformed shopping into an enjoyable public experience, rather than purchasing only necessities. Ladies wandered through beautifully arranged displays, admired imported goods from across the British Empire, and discussed the latest fashions with shop assistants. Yet even shopping followed rules of etiquette. One dressed appropriately, behaved politely, and understood that appearances inside these fashionable establishments mattered almost as much as the purchases themselves. Fashion itself demanded astonishing amounts of attention. Clothing was not simply chosen once and forgotten. Dresses required repairs, alterations, cleaning, and careful storage. Fabrics such as silk, satin, velvet, and fine wool represented significant investments. Ladies often met with dressmakers to discuss new gowns inspired by Parisian trends or the latest London fashions. Entire afternoons could disappear while selecting embroidery patterns, lace trims, sleeve designs, or suitable colours for upcoming social events. Because appearing in the same dress repeatedly at important gatherings might attract unwanted attention, wardrobes expanded continuously, particularly among the wealthiest families. Maintaining elegance became almost a full-time occupation. Many wealthy women also supervised extensive household inventories. Grand homes contained hundreds, sometimes thousands, of valuable objects, including silverware, porcelain, crystal, paintings, furniture, books, linens, and decorative ornaments. Inventories had to be checked regularly to prevent loss or theft. Household expenses required monitoring despite considerable wealth. Bills from merchants, butchers, florists, coal suppliers, wine merchants, and dressmakers accumulated throughout the month. While husbands generally controlled major financial decisions, wives frequently managed everyday domestic spending, ensuring that luxury remained balanced with responsible administration. Gardens occupied another surprisingly important place in upper-class life. Victorian gardens were carefully planned spaces designed to display both beauty and status. Wealthy women often discussed flower varieties with head gardeners, selected arrangements for indoor displays, and organized outdoor gatherings among blooming roses, neatly trimmed hedges, and ornamental fountains. Gardening itself was considered an elegant pastime when limited to gentle activities, such as arranging flowers or choosing new plants rather than heavy physical labor. Fresh flowers decorated nearly every important room in affluent homes, changing with the seasons and reflecting fashionable tastes. Books filled many quiet hours. Contrary to outdated stereotypes, numerous Victorian women read extensively. Their libraries contained works of history, travel, poetry, philosophy, religion, natural science, and fiction. The novels of the period frequently appeared in serialized installments, encouraging readers to eagerly await each new chapter. Reading aloud also remained a cherished family activity. During quiet evenings, one family member might entertain the others by reading a popular novel, a humorous essay, or a travel narrative describing distant lands. Such gatherings offered intellectual stimulation while reinforcing family bonds. Travel formed another significant aspect of upper-class life, though it required careful planning. During the summer, wealthy families often escaped crowded cities for country estates, coastal resorts, or mountain retreats believed to offer healthier air. Longer journeys across Europe became increasingly common as railway networks expanded and steamships shortened travel times. Visiting Switzerland, France, Italy, or Germany exposed affluent women to art galleries, ancient ruins, museums, and fashionable spas. Travel journals became treasured possessions, filled with observations about architecture, landscapes, and local customs. Yet even abroad, respectable behaviour remained essential, as British travellers were expected to represent their nation with dignity. Children occupied an unusual place within aristocratic households. Although mothers deeply cared for their sons and daughters, much of the daily childcare was delegated to nurses, governesses, and tutors. Infants often spent considerable time in nurseries, located away from the main living areas. Mothers typically visited at scheduled hours, rather than providing constant care themselves. As children grew older, wealthy women supervised their education, monitored their manners, and ensured they learned appropriate social behaviour. Daughters received instruction in music, drawing, languages, and etiquette, while sons prepared for prestigious schools and universities. Family affection certainly existed, but emotional expression often remained more restrained than modern families might expect. Religion quietly shaped everyday routines. Sunday represented the most obvious example, with church attendance viewed as both a spiritual obligation and a public demonstration of respectability. However, faith extended throughout the week. Daily Bible reading, private prayers, charitable giving, and participation in church organizations occupied many respectable women. Churches frequently relied upon wealthy ladies to organize fundraising events, decorate buildings for religious festivals, and support missionary societies operating throughout the expanding British Empire. Religious devotion also reinforced ideals of modesty, compassion, patience, and self-sacrifice that Victorian society praised in women. Illness, whether genuine or exaggerated, influenced many lives. Victorian medicine remained far less advanced than modern healthcare, and upper-class women frequently consulted physicians for complaints such as headaches, nervous exhaustion, digestive problems, or mysterious ailments that today might receive entirely different diagnoses. Some illnesses reflected the physical consequences of tightly laced corsets, poor ventilation, repetitive pregnancies, or limited exercise. Others resulted from emotional stress hidden beneath constant expectations of perfection. Doctors often prescribed fresh air, quiet rest, sea voyages, or lengthy stays in the countryside, rather than effective medical treatments. Entertainment within the home extended far beyond conversation. Families organized elaborate amateur performances featuring music, dramatic readings, comedy sketches, and recitations of famous poetry. Guests applauded politely, while talented relatives displayed their accomplishments. Parlor games challenged memory, wit, or creativity without crossing the boundaries of respectable behavior. Chess, card games, charades, and musical evenings offered enjoyable alternatives to formal public events, especially during long winter nights when travel became more difficult. One fascinating aspect of Victorian life was the enormous importance attached to etiquette manuals. Entire books instructed women how to greet visitors, arrange seating at dinner, address members of different social ranks, accept invitations, decline invitations politely, introduce strangers, behave during funerals, conduct themselves in church, and even how long eye contact should last during conversation. These manuals reflected a society deeply concerned with order and predictability. Learning these countless unwritten rules consumed years of careful observation and practice, particularly for young women preparing to enter fashionable society. Although servants completed much of the physical work, relationships between mistresses and domestic staff could be surprisingly complex. A lady depended upon loyal servants to maintain her household's smooth operation, while servants relied upon fair employers for stable livelihoods. The best households developed professional routines built upon mutual respect, though strict social boundaries remained firmly in place. Household discipline demanded attention. Servants who arrived late, neglected duties, or behaved dishonestly risked dismissal, making careful supervision an unavoidable responsibility. Not every wealthy Victorian woman accepted society's limitations without question. Throughout the 19th century, increasing numbers quietly supported educational reform, nursing, literature, scientific research, and eventually women's suffrage. Some attended lectures previously considered unsuitable for ladies. Others funded schools, hospitals, or libraries. A few became accomplished writers whose novels examined the very society in which they lived, exposing inequalities hidden beneath polished manners and luxurious drawing rooms. One everyday habit that would instantly surprise a modern visitor was how often people drank directly from the same bottle or glass, without giving it much thought. At family picnics, children passed bottles of soda from one person to another, each taking a sip before handing it along. During neighborhood baseball games, a single water jug might be shared by everyone. Concerns about germs certainly existed, but they were not discussed with the same intensity that people think about today. Sharing was simply part of daily life, and few imagined that future generations would carry personal water bottles almost everywhere they went. Another forgotten part of the decade was how powerful the local newspaper was. Every morning, newspapers landed on front porches before sunrise, and nearly every adult spent time reading them over breakfast. They weren't just filled with national headlines. They reported weddings, school events, church gatherings, sports scores, local birthdays, community meetings, and even who had recently returned from vacation. People genuinely knew what was happening in their town because almost everyone read the same newspaper. If your name appeared in the paper, chances were that half the neighborhood would know about it before lunchtime. Shopping for clothes required patience that would seem almost impossible today. There were no online reviews, no next day deliveries, and certainly no virtual fitting rooms. Families visited department stores, where sales assistants helped customers choose sizes and styles. Trying on clothes often involved waiting for an available fitting room, while store employees searched the stockroom for different sizes. If the item wasn't available, customers simply returned another day instead of expecting instant delivery. Another surprisingly normal sight was children carrying pocket knives. For many boys, a small folding knife was considered a practical tool rather than a dangerous object. It was used for carving sticks, cutting rope, sharpening pencils, or helping with outdoor chores. Parents often taught children how to use these tools responsibly from an early age, believing that learning responsibility mattered more than banning useful objects altogether. Household telephones also created situations that seem amusing today. Because there was only one phone in most homes, family members quickly learned to recognize each other's voices through walls. Teenagers often stretched the long telephone cord into another room hoping for privacy, only to have parents quietly pick up another extension and accidentally or intentionally listen in. Everyone knew that private conversations weren't always completely private. Rainstorms created a completely different atmosphere inside homes. Without endless digital entertainment, families often gathered near windows simply to watch the rain fall. Some listened to the sound of thunder while reading books. Others played cards around the dining table, and children eagerly waited for puddles to form outside, so they could splash through them afterward. Weather itself became entertainment because people spent far more time observing the natural world around them. Another curious custom involved wrapping nearly everything in paper. Butchers carefully wrapped fresh meat in thick brown paper before tying it with string. Bakeries packaged bread in paper bags instead of plastic. Department stores neatly folded clothing inside decorative boxes before wrapping them in colourful paper and ribbon. Even everyday purchases often felt special because store employees took pride in presenting items beautifully before customers carried them home. Many families also relied heavily on handwritten recipe cards passed down through generations. Instead of searching online, mothers and grandmothers kept small boxes filled with carefully written recipes, stained by years of cooking. Some recipes had no exact measurements at all, instructing readers to add a little butter or enough flour until it feels right. These treasured cards became family heirlooms, preserving traditions that survived far longer than many cookbooks. School report cards often carried as much weight as final exam results. Parents expected children to bring them home proudly, and teachers frequently included handwritten comments describing behavior, effort, and attitude. Good manners sometimes received almost as much attention as academic performance. A student who worked hard and respected teachers earned praise, even if their grades were not perfect. Known fascinating difference involved how people experienced boredom. Instead of immediately reaching for a screen, children invented games using almost anything they could find. Empty cardboard boxes became castles or spaceships. Sticks turned into imaginary swords. Blankets transformed into secret hideouts. Entire adventures unfolded without expensive toys, because imagination filled the gaps left by limited technology. Adults often encouraged this creativity, believing that children benefited from making their own fun. Another completely ordinary part of life involved neighborhood sounds that have almost disappeared. Every afternoon, the cheerful music of the ice cream truck echoed through residential streets, sending children racing outside with a few coins clutched tightly in their hands. The familiar ringing of bicycle bells, the whistle of distant trains, and the steady hum of lawn mowers created a soundtrack that many people still remember with deep nostalgia decades later. Even simple greetings reflected a slower and more personal way of living. People waved to strangers while walking down the street, greeted shopkeepers by name, and often stopped to chat with neighbors for several minutes before continuing on their way. Running errands could easily take twice as long because casual conversations happened almost everywhere. Perhaps one of the strangest habits of all was how little people documented their lives. Today, birthdays, vacations, meals, and even ordinary walks are photographed and shared within seconds. In the 1950s, many wonderful moments passed without a single picture being taken. There was something beautifully temporary about everyday life. People experienced moments because they were happening, not because they wanted to post them later. Looking back, that may be one of the biggest differences between the 1950s and today. It was a world where people owned fewer possessions, had fewer distractions, waited much longer for almost everything, and yet somehow found countless reasons to enjoy those forgotten routines, once considered completely normal, now offer a fascinating glimpse into a decade that feels both comfortingly familiar and wonderfully strange at the same time. Another everyday sight that feels almost unbelievable today was how many homes relied on a single family calendar hanging on the kitchen wall. Birthdays, doctor appointments, school events, and bill reminders were all written by hand for everyone to see. There were no digital reminders buzzing in pockets or smart assistants announcing upcoming appointments. If someone forgot to check the calendar before leaving the house, they simply hoped they hadn't missed anything important. The kitchen wall quietly served as the family's command center long before digital organizers existed. Children also grew up with responsibilities that many modern adults would consider surprisingly demanding. Before leaving for school, they often fed chickens, collected eggs, brought in firewood, watered gardens, or helped prepare breakfast. After school, homework came only after chores were finished. Mowing lawns, washing windows, sweeping porches, polishing shoes, and helping younger siblings were viewed as normal expectations rather than punishments. Parents believed that learning responsibility early prepared children for adulthood, and very few youngsters questioned these daily routines because nearly everyone they knew lived the same way. Public drinking fountains were another ordinary feature of everyday life. Schools, parks, train stations, shopping centres, and town squares all had fountains where complete strangers drank from the same water source throughout the day. Travellers rarely carried water bottles because they simply expected clean drinking fountains to be available wherever they went. On hot summer afternoons, children lined up after baseball games or bicycle rides without giving the shared fountain a second thought. Department stores often employed elevator operators, a profession that has almost completely disappeared. Instead of pressing buttons themselves, shoppers stepped into elevators where neatly dressed attendants greeted them politely, asked which floor they wished to visit, and manually operated the controls. The short ride often included friendly conversation before passengers thanked the operator while stepping out onto the next floor. It was such an ordinary job that few imagined automation would eventually replace it almost everywhere. Another surprisingly common habit involved polishing nearly everything made of metal. Brass door handles, silverware, trophies, serving trays, and decorative ornaments required regular polishing to maintain their shine. Families spent entire afternoons cleaning these household treasures because a well-maintained home reflected pride and respectability. Tarnished silver or dusty furniture suggested carelessness. So many people devoted considerable time each week to keeping their homes spotless. Many households also treated the family radio with enormous respect even after televisions became more popular. Radios remained switched on throughout the day, providing music, news, weather forecasts, comedy programs, and serialized dramas while people cooked, cleaned, or completed household chores. Entire families recognized the voices of famous radio announcers without ever seeing their faces. Long before playlists and streaming services, radio stations shaped the soundtrack of everyday life. Another forgotten tradition was the excitement surrounding new household appliances. Purchasing a washing machine, refrigerator, or vacuum cleaner was often celebrated because these items represented major investments that families expected to use for decades. Instruction manuals were carefully read from beginning to end. Warranties were stored safely inside drawers, and owners took pride in maintaining these expensive machines. Unlike today's rapid replacement culture, Appliances were built with the expectation that they would remain in service for many years. School field trips looked remarkably different as well. Permission slips were often much simpler, safety regulations were less complicated, and teachers trusted students with greater independence during excursions, whether visiting museums, farms, factories, or historical sites. Children explored with relatively little supervision compared to modern standards. Teachers expected students to behave responsibly because poor behavior reflected not only on the individual child, but also on their entire school. People also spent far more time writing letters than making telephone calls. Since long-distance calls remained expensive, handwritten letters became the preferred way to stay in touch with distant relatives and friends. Beautiful stationery, fountain pens, and carefully chosen envelopes turned letter writing into something of an art. Receiving a letter in the mailbox brought genuine excitement because each envelope represented personal effort, rather than a quick electronic message sent in seconds. Another strange but ordinary practice involved leaving windows open throughout much of the year. Fresh air was believed to promote good health, so many families opened windows from morning until evening. Whenever the weather allowed, curtains fluttered in the breeze, birdsong filled living rooms, and the sounds of neighborhood life drifted naturally into homes. Before widespread air conditioning, fresh air became the simplest and most affordable way to stay comfortable. One of the biggest differences between then and now was how people treated possessions. Furniture was expected to last for generations. Dining tables were handed down from grandparents. Clocks remained on walls for decades, and sewing machines often served multiple generations of the same family. Instead of replacing items whenever styles changed, people repaired, refinished, and treasured them. Owning fewer things often meant appreciating each possession much more deeply. Even waiting for birthdays felt different. Without online wish lists or endless advertisements following people across the internet, many children had only a vague idea of what gifts they might receive. Surprises remained genuine because information traveled slowly, and presents often reflected practical needs alongside a few carefully chosen treats. The excitement came as much from spending time together as from opening gifts. Perhaps the most fascinating difference was the slower rhythm of ordinary conversation. Without constant interruptions from buzzing phones, incoming emails, or social media notifications, people often focused entirely on whoever was speaking. Families lingered around dinner tables long after finishing their meals. Neighbors chatted over backyard fences without checking the time every few minutes. And friends could spend entire evenings simply talking on front porches as the sun disappeared below the horizon. Looking back, these moments reveal a world where life moved more slowly. Patience came naturally, and many of the habits people considered perfectly ordinary have quietly become some of the most remarkable glimpses into everyday history. One of the most ordinary experiences in the 1950s was waiting for the mail. Every afternoon, families listened for the familiar sound of the mail carrier making their way down the street. Children often raced to the mailbox, hoping to find a letter from a grandparent, a birthday card, or perhaps a magazine they had been eagerly anticipating. Bills arrived by mail. Invitations arrived by mail. Photographs arrived by mail. And even important government notices depended entirely on the postal service. There was something exciting about opening a handwritten envelope, because every letter represented time, effort, and genuine personal attention. Unlike today's instant messages that disappear with a swipe, many of these letters were carefully saved for years inside drawers and boxes. Another everyday sight that feels unusual today was how common public payphones were, mounted on street corners, inside restaurants, outside grocery stores, and at gas stations. These telephones connected people whenever they were away from home. Travelers always carried a few coins just in case they needed to make an important call. If someone promised a call at a certain time, they often searched for the nearest payphone rather than simply pulling a phone from their pocket. Waiting beside a payphone for an expected call was completely normal, and missing that call could mean waiting another entire day. Pets also lived very different lives. Dogs frequently rode in the backs of pickup trucks without anyone considering it dangerous. Cats wandered from yard to yard, becoming familiar with entire neighborhoods rather than remaining indoors. Many families fed pets table scraps instead of specially formulated food, and expensive pet accessories were almost non-existent. Animals were deeply loved, but the pet industry had not yet grown into the enormous business it is today. Household garbage looked remarkably different as well. Because products contained far less plastic, trash bins filled much more slowly than modern ones. Glass bottles were reused. Paper bags served multiple purposes. Cloth towels replaced disposable wipes, and leftovers were rarely thrown away. Even worn out clothing often found a second life as cleaning rags, quilt material, or patches for other garments. Waste existed, but people naturally reused many items simply because it made practical sense. Another forgotten custom involved polishing leather shoes almost every week. Before school or work, many families spent time brushing dirt from their shoes and applying polish until they shined. Children learned this routine early, and polished shoes became a symbol of self-respect. Athletic shoes were usually reserved for sports rather than everyday wear, meaning leather footwear accompanied people through much of their daily lives. Neighborhood grocery stores also operated on trust in ways that seem almost unbelievable now. Shopkeepers knew many customers by name and sometimes allowed families to buy groceries on credit if money was temporarily tight. Instead of using complicated approval systems, the store owner simply wrote the purchase into a notebook with the expectation that payment would come on payday. Personal relationships often mattered more than formal paperwork. Another curious habit involved saving wrapping paper, ribbons, and gift boxes after birthdays and holidays. Instead of throwing everything away, families carefully folded reusable paper, rolled ribbons neatly, and stored decorative boxes for future celebrations. It wasn't unusual to receive a gift wrapped in paper that had already celebrated another birthday years earlier. Frugality was respected, especially among adults who had experienced difficult economic times. Many people also carried handkerchiefs everywhere they went, tucked neatly into pockets or handbags. These reusable cloth squares served countless purposes, from wiping away sweat on hot afternoons to covering sneezes or cleaning eyeglasses. Disposable tissues existed, but reusable handkerchiefs remained an everyday essential for millions of people. Another ordinary but fascinating custom involved neighborhood children inventing their own sports rules. If there weren't enough players for baseball, they simply adjusted the rules. If someone's backyard became the playing field, imaginary boundaries were created using trees, fences, or flower beds. Games continued until sunset with very few adults organizing the activities. Children settled disagreements themselves most of the time, learning negotiation and compromise through everyday play. Public libraries became even more important during school holidays. Air-conditioned reading rooms offered cool escapes from summer heat, while shelves filled with adventure stories, mysteries, and science books sparked imaginations. Librarians often knew young readers personally, recommending new books based on previous favorites. visiting the library wasn't just about borrowing books. It became a weekly event that many children genuinely anticipated. Even something as simple as baking-filled neighborhoods with familiar smells. Homemade bread, fresh pies, cinnamon rolls, and cookies drifted from open kitchen windows, letting neighbors know someone was busy preparing treats inside. Recipes passed through generations created comforting scents that became part of the identity of entire communities. Without food delivery apps or ready-made desserts dominating kitchens, baking remained an ordinary skill practiced in countless homes. Perhaps the biggest surprise for someone visiting the 1950s would be discovering how little people hurried. Stores closed earlier, Sundays remained quieter, family dinners lasted longer, and conversations often unfolded without anyone constantly checking a clock. Life certainly included hard work, responsibilities, and challenges. But many everyday moments moved at a gentler pace. People accepted that some things simply took time. Whether it was writing a letter, developing photographs, repairing furniture, or growing vegetables in the backyard. Looking back today, those slow routines may seem strange, but they also remind us that history is often found in the simplest habits. Ordinary moments that quietly disappeared as technology transformed the rhythm of everyday life forever. One everyday experience that would surprise many people today was how often complete strangers trusted one another. If a family was traveling through a small town and needed directions, they simply rolled down the car window and asked someone walking along the street. That person might not only explain the route, but sometimes even offer to drive ahead so the visitors could follow. Neighbors regularly watched each other's homes during vacations without formal arrangements. And borrowing everyday items happened so frequently that people rarely bothered keeping track of exactly when something had been lent out. Trust was never perfect, but in many communities it formed the foundation of daily life in ways that feel unusual today. Another forgotten custom involved keeping emergency supplies inside nearly every car. Blankets, basic tools, extra fan belts, spare tires, flashlights, and even cans of motor oil were considered sensible items. Because vehicles required much more regular maintenance than modern cars, drivers expected to occasionally lift the hood, check fluid levels, or tighten loose parts during long trips. A breakdown by the side of the road was inconvenient, but not especially shocking, because almost every driver had experienced something similar. The weekly trip to the barber or beauty salon often became an important social event rather than a quick appointment. Customers chatted for long periods while waiting their turn, exchanging neighborhood news, discussing sporting events, or debating the latest television programs. Many people visited the same barber or hairstylist for decades, creating friendships that lasted throughout their lives. The haircut itself sometimes seemed almost secondary to the conversations taking place around it. Another perfectly ordinary sight involved clothes drying outside on long lines stretching across backyards. Entire neighborhoods displayed colorful rows of shirts, dresses, towels, and bedsheets, gently moving in the breeze. Fresh air and sunshine naturally dried clothing, while leaving behind a scent many people still remember fondly. Children sometimes ran between the hanging sheets, turning laundry day into another excuse for imaginative games, while parents finished household chores nearby. People also treated magazines very differently than they do today. Instead of quickly reading an article and throwing the magazine away, families often kept stacks of them for months, or even years. Waiting rooms filled with carefully arranged magazines, coffee tables displayed the latest editions proudly, and children eagerly read comic books repeatedly until the pages became worn. Recipes, knitting patterns, gardening advice, and household tips were clipped out and stored neatly for future use. Another fascinating habit was how common neighborhood repairmen were. If the television stopped working, someone came to the house to fix it. If the washing machine failed, a local repairman examined it instead of immediately recommending a replacement. Shoe repair shops restored worn soles. Radio technicians repaired broken speakers, and watchmakers carefully serviced mechanical watches piece by piece. Throwing away expensive possessions after a minor malfunction seemed unnecessarily wasteful. Many families also kept vegetable gardens, even in suburban neighborhoods. Tomatoes, beans, carrots, onions, cucumbers, lettuce, and herbs filled backyards during the warmer months. Gardening wasn't simply a hobby. It helped reduce grocery costs while providing fresh food throughout the season. Children learned how vegetables grew by helping water plants remove weeds and harvest ripe produce. Surplus vegetables were often shared with neighbors, strengthening community relationships through simple acts of generosity. Another everyday custom involved polishing household furniture with remarkable care. Wooden dining tables, cabinets, bookshelves, and chairs received regular attention, using special oils and waxes designed to preserve their appearance. Families expected these pieces to last for generations, so maintaining them became part of ordinary weekly cleaning routines. Small scratches were repaired rather than ignored, and furniture often became treasured family heirlooms passed from parents to children. Weather forecasts also inspired a very different kind of preparation. Since predictions were less accurate than they are today, people relied heavily on personal observation. Farmers watched bird behavior, cloud formations, wind direction, and changes in air pressure. Older relatives often claimed they could predict rain simply by noticing aching joints or observing animal behavior. Whether scientifically accurate or not, these traditions became part of everyday conversation whenever dark clouds appeared on the horizon. Children also grew up learning practical skills that many adults today never need to master. They patched bicycle tires, built simple wooden shelves, planted gardens, tied fishing knots, sharpened pocket knives, and learned basic sewing repairs. Schools and parents believed these everyday abilities encouraged independence, and children often took pride in solving small problems without immediately asking adults for help. Another ordinary but fascinating part of life involved the sound of neighborhood bells and whistles. Factory whistles announced shift changes, church bells marked important hours, school bells echoed across playgrounds, and ice cream trucks announced their arrival with cheerful music that children recognized instantly. Before smartphones and digital calendars reminded people where to be, these familiar sounds quietly organized the rhythm of daily life. Home entertainment also required more imagination than expensive equipment. Families gathered around puzzles that remained spread across dining tables for weeks, worked together on model airplanes or trains, played charades in living rooms, or listened to dramatic radio stories, while imagining every scene inside their minds. Entertainment depended far less on technology and much more on participation, conversation, and creativity. Perhaps one of the most remarkable differences was how ordinary patience seemed to everyone. If someone ordered a new sofa, they expected to wait several weeks. If a favorite product sold out, they simply came back another time. If relatives lived hundreds of miles away, months might pass between visits without anyone feeling neglected. People adjusted their expectations to match the pace of the world around them. Looking back now, that slower rhythm almost feels impossible to imagine. yet it shaped countless ordinary days throughout the 1950s. These simple routines, many forgotten, many replaced, and many transformed by technology, reveal that history isn't only made through famous events. Sometimes it is hidden inside the quiet habits of everyday people, living lives that seemed completely ordinary, then but appear wonderfully strange today. One of the most overlooked parts of everyday life in the 1950s was how seriously people treated mealtime. Dinner was rarely something eaten while walking through the house or staring at a screen. Families gathered around the dining table at roughly the same time each evening, and everyone was generally expected to be present unless there was a good reason not to be. The television was often turned off. Conversations filled the room, and children were encouraged to discuss their school day, while parents talked about work or neighborhood news. Table manners were taught from an early age, and many households considered elbows on the table or speaking with a full mouth to be unacceptable. Looking back, what seems unusual isn't the meal itself, but how consistently families protected that shared time. Another perfectly ordinary custom involved keeping a small notebook beside the telephone. Every important number was written down by hand because there was no contact list to save names automatically. Families carefully recorded relatives, doctors, schools, plumbers, electricians, and local businesses in alphabetical order. If someone changed their phone number, everyone had to update their notebooks manually. Losing that notebook could be surprisingly stressful because it contained years of carefully collected information. Another sight that would puzzle many modern people was the amount of formal clothing worn during ordinary activities. Men often wore jackets and ties just to go shopping downtown, while women frequently dressed in skirts or dresses even for routine errands. Children were expected to look neat before leaving the house, and parents often reminded them that they represented the family whenever they appeared in public. Looking presentable was considered a matter of personal pride, rather than something reserved only for special occasions. Birthday celebrations also looked surprisingly modest compared to today. Instead of elaborate themed decorations, giant inflatable displays, or professional entertainers, most birthdays took place in the family home. Friends gathered for homemade cake, simple games, and perhaps a few carefully chosen presents. The excitement came from being together rather than creating the biggest celebration possible. Many children remembered those birthdays fondly because the focus remained on family and friendship instead of expensive entertainment. Another forgotten routine involved shining silverware before holidays or family gatherings. Large families often owned sets of silver utensils reserved for special occasions, and preparing them required careful polishing until every spoon and fork gleamed. It could take hours to remove tarnish, but many people considered the effort worthwhile because beautifully prepared tables reflected hospitality and respect for guests. Daily exercise looked very different as well. Most people didn't visit gyms or count their daily steps. Instead, physical activity naturally occurred throughout everyday life. People walked to nearby stores, pushed lawn mowers by hand, worked in gardens, carried groceries without wheeled carts, climbed stairs instead of using elevators, and completed household chores that demanded genuine physical effort. Staying active happened almost automatically because daily routines required much more movement than many modern lifestyles. Another fascinating custom involved collecting stamps inside special books. Children and adults alike exchanged stamps from different countries, carefully soaking them from envelopes before arranging them neatly into albums. Every unusual stamp represented a tiny glimpse into another part of the world, making stamp collecting one of the most popular hobbies of the decade. Households also placed enormous value on repairing torn books. School textbooks, favorite novels and family Bibles often remained in use for decades. Torn pages were carefully taped, damaged covers were reinforced, and names were written neatly inside the front cover to remind everyone who owned the book. Books weren't viewed as disposable objects, but as possessions worthy of long-term care. Even something as ordinary as waiting for a bus felt completely different. Passengers simply stood together, talked with one another, or quietly watched traffic pass by. There were no phones to scroll through, no wireless earbuds blocking conversation, and no endless stream of notifications competing for attention. Waiting became another opportunity to notice the world rather than escape from it. Children also spent remarkable amounts of time building things from scraps. Empty wooden crates became racing cars. Leftover boards transformed into tree houses, cardboard boxes turned into castles, and old blankets created secret forts that lasted for weeks. Imagination often mattered far more than expensive toys, because children learned to create adventures using whatever materials happened to be nearby. Another surprisingly normal habit involved greeting nearly everyone while walking through town. Whether someone was a close friend or merely a familiar face, a smile, wave, or brief conversation was expected. Shopkeepers recognized regular customers immediately. Postal workers knew family names, and local police officers often knew many residents personally. Communities felt smaller because daily interactions happened face-to-face instead of through screens. Perhaps one of the strangest differences was how comfortable people were with not knowing everything immediately. If a question came up during dinner, it might remain unanswered until someone visited the library days later. If relatives lived overseas, weeks could pass before receiving news from them. If someone wanted to learn a new skill, they usually found a book or asked an experienced neighbor rather than watching a tutorial online. Information moved much more slowly, but people rarely found that frustrating because it was simply the way life worked. Looking back today, the everyday routines of the 1950s reveal a world where people owned less, repaired more, waited longer, and depended heavily on one another. Many of those habits disappeared so gradually that few people noticed them fading away. Yet together, they paint a fascinating picture of a decade that balanced remarkable optimism with surprisingly simple routines. What once seemed completely ordinary has become one of the most interesting windows into the past, reminding us that today's normal habits may someday seem just as strange to future generations. One of the most ordinary sounds in a 1950s neighborhood was the cheerful call of children playing outside from morning until sunset. Sidewalks became racetracks for bicycles, empty lots transformed into baseball fields, and quiet streets echoed with games of tag, hopscotch, marbles, and jump rope. Parents rarely scheduled these activities. Children simply gathered naturally whenever enough friends appeared outdoors. Arguments were usually settled without adults stepping in, and games constantly evolved as new children joined or left throughout the day. Entire summers passed with youngsters inventing adventures that required little more than imagination and a few willing friends. Another surprisingly common habit involved saving leftovers in whatever containers happened to be available. Glass jars from jam, coffee tins, biscuit containers, and even old butter tubs found second lives storing everything from soup to sewing supplies. Opening a cupboard often revealed containers holding something completely different from what their labels suggested. Reusing household items wasn't considered environmentally friendly. It was simply practical, economical, and something almost everyone did without thinking. Another forgotten part of daily life was the ritual of shining floors. Many homes featured hardwood floors that required regular waxing and polishing by hand. Families spent hours applying wax before carefully buffing the surface until it reflected light like a mirror. Children sometimes helped by sliding across the polished floor while standing on soft cloths attached to their feet, turning a household chore into a playful activity. Keeping floors spotless was considered another sign of maintaining a respectable home. Buying a new television was also an unforgettable event. Because televisions were expensive, entire families gathered excitedly when one finally arrived. Neighbors occasionally stopped by just to see the latest model or watch important broadcasts together. During major sporting events or special television programs, living rooms filled with relatives and friends. Because not every household owned a television set yet, sharing entertainment became a normal part of community life. Another everyday custom that has almost disappeared involved carefully folding and storing grocery bags. Paper bags rarely went straight into the trash. They were flattened neatly and reused for schoolbook covers, storage, carrying lunches, wrapping gifts, or collecting garden vegetables. Every household seemed to find countless uses for something that many people today would discard immediately. Another fascinating habit was how often families listened to weather reports on the radio before making plans. Farmers especially paid close attention because a single unexpected storm could damage crops or delay harvests. Even families planning picnics or weekend outings often gathered around the radio to hear the latest forecast, rather than checking an app every few minutes. Once they left home, however, they simply accepted whatever weather arrived, because constant updates were impossible. Local movie theatres created another unique social tradition. Going to the cinema wasn't simply about watching a film. It often became an entire evening out. People dressed neatly, greeted friends they happened to meet in line, and enjoyed cartoons or short newsreels before the main feature began. Since television programming remained limited, visiting the local theatre remained one of the most exciting forms of entertainment for families and teenagers alike. Many schools also expected students to memorize far more information than children often do today. Multiplication tables, poetry, historical dates, state capitals, and lengthy passages were learned by heart, because instant access to information didn't exist. Teachers believed a well-trained memory was an essential life skill, and students regularly recited lessons aloud in front of the class. Another surprisingly normal routine involved checking the family car before every longer journey. Drivers examined tire pressure, oil levels, coolant, windshield wipers, and spare tires, because automobiles required considerably more attention than modern vehicles. Preparing for a road trip often began the evening before departure, with fathers inspecting engines while children helped pack suitcases and blankets into the trunk. Shopping for furniture also required extraordinary patience. Instead of browsing hundreds of options online, families visited local furniture stores, where they carefully compared a handful of pieces expected to last for decades. Purchasing a dining table or sofa represented a major financial decision, and many couples spent weeks discussing their choices before making a final purchase. Another interesting custom involved collecting recipe booklets offered free by food companies. Flour manufacturers, butter producers, and soup companies frequently printed small cookbooks filled with recipes featuring their products. Housewives collected these booklets inside kitchen drawers, gradually building entire libraries of recipes without ever buying expensive cookbooks. People also depended heavily on local repair skills. Instead of replacing worn possessions, umbrellas received new fabric, lamps were rewired, clocks were cleaned and repaired, and even chipped dishes were sometimes carefully mended. Throwing away useful items often felt almost irresponsible, because skilled craftsmen could restore so many things to working condition. Another ordinary part of everyday life involved respecting quiet evenings. After dinner, neighborhoods gradually became peaceful as families relaxed on porches, read newspapers, worked on hobbies, or visited nearby friends, without endless electronic entertainment filling every hour. Evenings often unfolded at a gentler pace. The sounds of insects, distant train whistles, barking dogs, and softly playing radios became the background music of countless summer nights. Perhaps the most remarkable difference wasn't any single object or tradition, but the remarkable ability people had to entertain themselves with simple pleasures. Watching clouds drift across the sky, sitting beside a fishing pond, reading a favorite novel for the third time, building a puzzle over several evenings, or simply talking with family members required no subscription, battery, or internet connection. Life certainly had its hardships, uncertainties, and limitations, but ordinary moments were often filled with patience, creativity, and face-to-face connection. Those everyday experiences may seem unusual now, yet they reveal why so many people remember the 1950s, not only for its strange customs, but also for its slower rhythm, stronger local communities, and countless small traditions that quietly disappeared as the modern world rushed forward. Imagine waking up in the middle of an ordinary weekday during the 1950s and discovering just how many small details of everyday life would feel strangely unfamiliar. Before your feet even touched the floor, you might notice that many bedrooms had no digital alarm clocks glowing beside the bed. Instead, a loud mechanical clock ticked steadily through the night, before suddenly erupting with a sharp ringing sound that practically forced people awake. Once the alarm was switched off, there were no phones waiting with overnight notifications, emails, weather updates, or social media messages. The morning began in complete silence, except for birds outside the window, the distant sound of a passing train, or the radio slowly warming up in the kitchen. That quiet beginning to the day was completely ordinary. Another surprising detail was how little packaging people threw away. Glass jars became drinking glasses, cookie tins became sewing boxes, cigar boxes stored family photographs, and old newspapers lined kitchen shelves or wrapped fragile dishes before moving house. Almost every object seemed to have a second purpose. Throwing something away immediately after using it often felt wasteful, because someone in the household could almost always think of another use for it. Kitchens themselves looked very different from modern ones. Refrigerators were much smaller, freezers held fewer items, and families visited local grocery stores far more frequently because they bought only what they expected to eat within the next few days. Fresh bread often came from neighborhood bakeries. Instead of remaining soft for weeks inside plastic packaging, milk spoiled more quickly, vegetables followed the seasons, and leftovers were transformed into entirely new meals rather than quietly disappearing into the trash. Waste was discouraged, not because of environmental campaigns, but because many adults still remembered difficult economic years when wasting perfectly good food simply wasn't an option. Another forgotten custom involved greeting almost everyone who entered a room, whether arriving at church, attending a family gathering, or walking into a local business. People often shook hands, introduced themselves properly, and exchanged a few polite words before getting down to business. Good manners were expected almost everywhere, and children practiced them daily until they became second nature. It was considered respectful to stand when an older person entered the room, offer seats to guests, and address adults using formal titles instead of first names. Even simple conversations followed unwritten rules of politeness that modern visitors might find surprisingly formal. Another ordinary part of life involved living with far fewer choices. A grocery store might offer only a handful of cereal brands instead of entire aisles filled with nearly identical products. Television viewers often chose between only 2 or 3 channels during the evening. Clothing stores displayed smaller selections, restaurants served shorter menus, and many towns had only one pharmacy, one hardware store, and one department store. Rather than feeling restricted, most people simply accepted these limited choices because they had never experienced anything different. In many ways, making decisions required less time because there were fewer alternatives competing for attention. Public transportation also carried its own unusual customs. Bus conductors and ticket clerks often recognized regular passengers by name. Travelers dressed neatly, even for short journeys, believing that appearing presentable showed respect for fellow passengers. Reading newspapers remained the most common way to pass the time while commuting, and complete strangers regularly struck up conversations about sports, politics, or the weather without feeling awkward. Silence certainly existed, but it was not automatically filled by staring into handheld screens, because such distractions simply did not exist. Another curious feature of daily life was how common neighborhood sounds became part of everyone's routine. Early mornings echoed with milk trucks, newspaper deliveries, factory whistles, barking dogs, and lawn sprinklers beginning their work. Afternoons brought children laughing outdoors, bicycles rattling across sidewalks, baseball games in nearby parks, and the occasional ringing bell of the ice cream truck. Evenings slowed into quieter rhythms filled with radios drifting through open windows, conversations on front porches, and crickets replacing the noise of the day. These sounds created a sense of familiarity that many people remembered for decades after moving away. Clothing care also demanded far more effort than most wardrobes require today. Shirts were carefully ironed before work, shoes polished regularly, and loose buttons repaired almost immediately. Women frequently altered dresses to keep up with changing fashions instead of replacing entire wardrobes. Wool coats received careful storage during summer months to protect them from moths, while hats were brushed clean before returning them to shelves or hooks near the front door. People generally owned fewer clothes, but each piece received much greater care. Another everyday habit that seems almost unbelievable now involved sharing almost everything. Brothers often shared bedrooms, sisters borrowed each other's dresses, families shared one bathroom, neighbors shared gardening tools, and relatives passed baby clothes from one household to another as children grew older. Owning duplicates of every useful item simply wasn't necessary because communities naturally helped one another whenever the need arose. Another forgotten routine involved preparing for bad weather without relying on instant forecasts. Families watched the sky carefully, secured outdoor furniture before storms, and listened closely to radio weather bulletins. During winter, people stored extra blankets, candles, and canned food because heavy snow sometimes isolated neighborhoods for several days. These preparations became ordinary seasonal rituals repeated year after year without much complaint. Entertainment also unfolded much more slowly. A new record album might be played dozens of times until every lyric became familiar. Favorite books were reread repeatedly because replacing them wasn't always affordable. Puzzle books, knitting projects, woodworking, gardening, and collecting stamps or coins filled countless evenings. Families often worked on hobbies together, simply because they enjoyed each other's company. Another remarkable difference involved the amount of patience built into everyday life. Film rolls had to be developed before photographs could be seen. Ordered furniture might take months to arrive. Letters travelled across the country for days before reaching their destination. Repair shops often kept appliances for weeks before returning them. Yet people rarely described these delays as unbearable because they reflected the normal pace of the world around them. Expectations naturally matched the technology available. Schools reinforced many customs that now seem unusual. Students stood respectfully when teachers entered classrooms, recited the Pledge of Allegiance together each morning in many American schools, and practiced neat cursive handwriting until every letter looked carefully formed. Report cards frequently evaluated manners, cleanliness, punctuality, and effort alongside academic performance. Children also learned practical skills including sewing, woodworking, cooking, typing, and household budgeting, because educators believed these abilities prepared students for adulthood. Another fascinating custom involved neighborhood evenings during warm weather. Instead of remaining indoors, families carried folding chairs onto front porches or front lawns, where they spent hours talking with neighbors walking by. Children chased fireflies, while adults exchanged stories about work, gardens, local events, or upcoming holidays. These casual conversations required no invitations or scheduling apps. They happened naturally because people expected to spend time outdoors whenever the weather allowed. Another strange but completely ordinary habit involved saving almost every important piece of paper. Instruction manuals, warranties, newspaper clippings, greeting cards, recipes, family letters, and report cards were carefully stored inside drawers, boxes, or albums. Families understood that replacing these items might prove impossible, so preserving them became second nature. Even wrapping paper from Christmas presents might be folded neatly for another celebration months later. Looking after possessions extended their usefulness far beyond what many people expect today. Another overlooked part of life was the importance of local businesses. Instead of giant supermarkets dominating every purchase, families often visited separate butcher shops, bakeries, pharmacies, hardware stores, and produce markets throughout the week. Shop owners knew regular customers personally, remembered their preferences, and occasionally set aside favorite products before they even arrived. Shopping became a social activity rather than simply completing transactions as quickly as possible. Another curious difference involved how people experienced boredom. There were long moments with nothing specific to do, yet those quiet periods often produced creativity. Children invented games using sticks, stones, cardboard boxes, or old blankets. Adults repaired furniture, planted flowers, learned musical instruments, or simply sat reading while rain tapped gently against windows. Being bored wasn't viewed as a problem requiring immediate entertainment. Instead, it encouraged imagination to fill the empty space. Another everyday tradition involved handwritten invitations for weddings, anniversaries, birthdays, and holiday dinners. As the sun began to set over a typical 1950s neighborhood, another collection of everyday customs quietly came to life. Customs that would seem surprisingly unusual today. One of the first things you might notice is how many people simply sat outside doing absolutely nothing in particular. Families placed folding chairs on their front lawns or settled onto wooden porch swings, waving at neighbors as they passed by. There was no urgent need to be constantly entertained. People watched children play, admired the evening sky, discussed local gossip, or simply enjoyed the cool breeze after a warm day. Silence was comfortable, and conversation flowed naturally, without anyone being distracted by vibrating phones or glowing screens. Even the way people planned their week was completely different. There were no shared online calendars or reminder apps. Important dates were remembered through habit, handwritten notes, or simple memory. Families knew that Thursday was grocery day, Friday was payday, Sunday meant church, and certain evenings were reserved for visiting relatives. Life followed dependable routines that changed very little from one week to the next. That predictability created a comforting rhythm, even if it might seem repetitive to modern eyes. Another surprisingly normal habit involved repairing children's toys rather than replacing them. If a doll lost an arm, someone carefully stitched it back together. If a toy train stopped working, fathers often opened it with small screwdrivers to fix the mechanism. Broken wagons received new wheels, bicycles gained replacement chains, and stuffed animals were patched so many times they became even more treasured than when they were new. Toys carried memories, and keeping them alive felt more meaningful than buying something brand new. Another forgotten sight was the amount of handwritten signs displayed in shop windows. Local businesses proudly announced daily specials using chalkboards or carefully painted lettering. Bakers wrote the day's fresh bread selection by hand. Hardware stores advertised seasonal tools on cardboard signs. Restaurants listed homemade soups in beautiful cursive writing near the entrance. Every sign reflected a personal touch that large printed advertisements rarely capture today. Even neighborhood dogs behaved differently because communities themselves functioned differently. It wasn't unusual for friendly dogs to wander from one yard to another, receiving pats on the head from several families before eventually returning home. Many neighbors knew which dog belonged to which household without needing collars displaying contact information. Pets became familiar members of the community rather than remaining almost entirely within their own homes. One fascinating custom involved polishing family heirlooms before special occasions. Whether it was an old pocket watch, a silver tea set, or a grandfather's favorite chair, families devoted time to preserving objects that carried sentimental value. Instead of constantly replacing possessions with newer versions, people often cherished older items precisely because they had belonged to previous generations. Every scratch and worn edge reminded them of family history. Another perfectly ordinary part of daily life involved handwritten school excuses. If a child missed class due to illness, parents simply wrote a short note explaining the absence. Teachers accepted these notes without expecting digital records, automated attendance systems, or electronic communication. Many schools kept stacks of neatly folded notes inside filing cabinets as part of each student's record. Children also spent astonishing amounts of time observing nature. They searched for bird nests, watched ants build colonies, collected unusual leaves, examined insects through magnifying glasses, and identified constellations on clear nights. Without endless digital entertainment competing for attention, curiosity naturally drifted toward the world outside. Entire afternoons disappeared while children explored forests, streams, fields, or vacant lots, discovering tiny details many adults hardly noticed anymore. Another strange, but completely accepted habit involved carrying photographs inside wallets. Instead of storing thousands of pictures digitally, people often carried only a few carefully chosen photographs of spouses, children, parents, or close friends. These small black and white images became treasured reminders of loved ones, shown proudly whenever conversations turned toward family. Waiting rooms also reflected a different pace of life. Whether visiting the dentist, barber, or doctor's office, people patiently waited their turn while reading magazines or chatting quietly with strangers. Nobody complained about not having Wi-Fi because such a concept didn't exist. Waiting simply became another ordinary part of the day rather than something to escape through endless scrolling. Another forgotten tradition involved neighborhood talent shows and community gatherings. Churches, schools, and local organizations regularly hosted evenings where residents sang songs, performed comedy sketches, played musical instruments, or recited poetry. Entertainment came directly from friends and neighbors instead of professional performers. These events strengthened communities because everyone participated rather than simply watching from a distance. Many families also owned only one camera, and it was treated with enormous care. It was stored safely inside protective cases, brought out only for birthdays, holidays, graduations, or vacations, and handled almost like a valuable family treasure. Children were often reminded not to touch it without permission, because replacing it would be expensive. Another everyday habit involved cleaning shoes before entering the house. Muddy boots remained outside or near the entrance, especially in rural communities where dirt roads were common. Keeping the house clean required constant effort, because families spent much more time outdoors than many people do today. Another curious custom was the excitement surrounding catalogue shopping. Thick mail, order catalogues, allowed families to browse hundreds of products without leaving home. People spent evenings turning page after page, discussing which furniture, clothing, toys, or household items they might eventually save enough money to purchase. Long before online shopping, these catalogues inspired dreams of future purchases while bringing the wider world directly into the living room. Even the pace of conversation was noticeably slower. People allowed pauses without feeling uncomfortable. Stories unfolded gradually. Jokes weren't interrupted by phone notifications, and family discussions often continued for hours around the dinner table or fireplace. Listening carefully was considered just as important as speaking, creating conversations that many would now describe as remarkably patient. Perhaps the most unusual difference of all was how completely people separated work from home. When fathers returned from the office or factory, work generally stayed there until the next morning. There were no late night emails, emergency video meetings, or constant workplace notifications demanding attention. Evenings belonged primarily to family, neighbors, hobbies, and rest. That clear boundary between professional life and personal life shaped a daily rhythm that has become increasingly rare in the modern world. Looking back, these ordinary moments reveal a society that measured time differently. Convenience certainly existed, but it had not yet replaced patience. Technology offered impressive innovations for the era, yet it had not become the center of everyday existence. The people of the 1950s laughed with friends instead of sending emojis, remembered phone numbers instead of storing them in devices, repaired treasured belongings instead of replacing them, and built communities through countless face-to-face interactions. To them, these habits seemed perfectly ordinary. To us, they have become some of the most fascinating reminders of just how dramatically everyday life has changed in only a few generations.